If I told you that the phone you are holding in your hand, the personal freedom you are enjoying, the delicious meals you have every day, and this entire brilliantly modern world were actually built on the ashes of 50 million corpses, would you believe it? It is cruel and hard to accept, but the truth of history is just that cold-blooded. If the worst disaster in human history had never happened, you and I right now might still be wallowing in the mud of some nameless farm, enslaved to a lord whose face we would never dare to look up at. It all began on a gloomy day in 1347. 12 merchant ships from the Black Sea silently cut through the waves and docked at the port of Messina in Sicily, Italy. The people standing on the docks waited eagerly, their eyes longing for the shimmering silks, exquisite ceramics, and expensive spices from the distant east. But they had no idea that, hidden deep within those dark, foul, and damp cargo holds, there was more than just merchandise. There was an invisible stowaway waiting to rewrite the entire trajectory of humanity. It was Yersinia pestis, a tiny bacterium transmitted by fleas parasitic on black rats. This silent killer brought with it a death sentence that later generations would call by a haunting name, the Black Death. In just 5 short years, from 1347 to 1351, that bacterium wiped out 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. It claimed the lives of about 50 million people on the old continent and an estimated 200 million globally. These numbers are too massive for our brains to comprehend. Imagine that for every 3 people you know, 1 or 2 simply vanished forever in agonizing pain. Families were torn apart overnight, bustling villages were entirely wiped out and turned into dead zones. Everywhere on the streets were carts piled high with corpses, while church bells rang incessantly until there was no one left alive to ring them. To this day, it remains the deadliest, most devastating pandemic, leaving the deepest scar in the memory of human civilization. No normal person would ever wish for such a tragedy to occur. Preventing suffering is always a human instinct. But history does not operate on empathy or morality. It is a massive machine of cause and effect. By analyzing macro-historical economic models, data on ecological limits, and the decline of the feudal system, we can see a completely different and terrifying picture. If you are passionate about the naked truths of history, if you want to know why cruelty sometimes serves as the midwife to humanity's greatest leaps forward, then join me on this time travel journey. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so we can continue to uncover the thorniest mysteries of the world. Now, let's peel back the truth. How did history's worst pandemic smash and reshape our world? To understand what the world would be like if those disease-carrying rats had been exterminated right offshore, we must thoroughly understand what the Black Death actually destroyed. Before 1347, Europe was not a romantic place like in fairy tales. It was a giant prison operated under a brutal feudal system. You can picture it as an ironclad pyramid. At the towering peak were the kings, right below them were the nobles and lords who owned all the land, resources, and laws. And at the bottom, deep in the mud, were tens of millions of serfs. They were not free peasants. They were property. They owned absolutely nothing, working from sunrise to sunset, exploited to the point of exhaustion just to exchange for a place to rest on a pile of straw and some dry crusts of bread. Europe's biggest problem at the time was overpopulation. The population had exploded to a point that exceeded the land's carrying capacity. Laborers were everywhere, packed together. And in economics, when supply is excessively abundant, value hits rock bottom. The life and labor of a human being were disgustingly cheap. If a serf died of exhaustion or dared to open his mouth to complain about injustice, the lord only needed to snap his fingers, and dozens of other starving people would rush in begging to take his place, ready to accept a wage of absolute zero, as long as they were fed. The poor had absolutely no voice, no hope, and not a shred of power in their hands. Then the Black Death struck like a firestorm. Suddenly, everything was turned upside down. Half of the workforce in Europe vanished. Groans replaced the sounds of plowing. And as the pandemic began to recede, the survivors stepped out of their homes to witness an unprecedented reality: fields of ripe wheat rotting on the stalk because there was no one to harvest them, sheep and cattle wandering astray, while feudal lords stood on their castle balconies, sweating profusely as their wealth rotted away day by day. It turns out, the fastest way to demand a raise isn't protesting, isn't peaceful negotiation, but when half of your coworkers get wiped off the face of the earth. Scarcity creates value, even if it's the value of a human life. For the first time in human history, dirt-covered peasants realized they held in their hands the very thing the elite craved, bargaining power. They began doing something their ancestors never dared to imagine. They stood up straight in front of the Lord and said, "I will no longer work for you unless you pay me decent gold coins, give me better food, and give me freedom." The lords were furious. They passed laws banning wage increases, but to no avail. The free market had spoken. If this lord didn't pay, the serf would pack up and move to the land of another lord who was desperately looking for workers. Real wages skyrocketed. The centuries-old chains of serfdom shattered, replaced by a more reasonable system of land leasing and wage labor. The feudal pyramid began to collapse from the bottom. As workers began to have money, another earth-shattering event occurred, the birth of the middle class. Previously, the world only had two extremes, the ultra-rich and the ultra-poor. But now, peasants who had accumulated wealth began to leave the fields. They saw opportunities in the emptying towns. They flocked to cities, learned new trades, opened craft workshops, became merchants, and traded goods. An entirely new class emerged, situated between the rulers and the manual laborers. This middle class was the jet engine of history. With deep pockets, the newly emerging middle class wouldn't settle for a dull life. They began to crave finer things, silk from China, spices from India, perfumes from Arabia. This massive consumer demand fueled the explosion of global trade networks, forcing explorers to set sail and paving the way for the great geographic discoveries later on. But more important than money was the shift in mindset. No longer having to struggle for their next meal, people began to think about beauty, philosophy, and existence. The middle class and wealthy merchants began using their money to patronize painters, sculptors, and scientists. They paid to build timeless architectural marvels, paintings that celebrated human beauty rather than just honoring deities. The massive influx of cash and the fierce desire to live after the pandemic were the sparks that ignited a colossal explosion of intellect and culture that we respectfully call the Renaissance. The rise of humanity after the pandemic didn't stop at art or economics. It also created a bloody but necessary revolution in medicine and knowledge. Before the Black Death, medicine in Europe was a dogma of conservatism and ignorance. Medieval doctors donned black cloaks, wore bird-beak masks stuffed with herbs, muttered incantations, and blindly trusted the ancient texts of the Roman physician Galen from thousands of years prior. Books from that era were considered the absolute truth of God. Dissecting the human body was forbidden, and questioning was forbidden. But as tens of millions of people collapsed, blood and black plague oozing from their bodies, all ancient remedies, all bloodletting and cupping became useless, ridiculous, and pathetic. Doctors stood among the corpses and realized a bitter truth, blindly believing in thousands of years old knowledge was directly killing them and their patients. The collapse of the old medical system forced people to open their eyes to reality. When the pandemic subsided, a new generation of doctors emerged. They threw the ancient books into the corner of the room. They picked up scalpels and began dissecting corpses to observe firsthand the mechanics of the heart, liver, and lungs. Surgery and experimental anatomy, things once considered blasphemous sins, began to become the foundation of modern medicine. Hospitals completely changed as well. Previously, hospitals were just filthy quarantine zones, places where the sick and weak were tossed in to wait for death and pray. After the pandemic, hospitals transformed into true treatment centers, with higher standards of hygiene and clean spaces, laying the groundwork for the healthcare system we use today. Along with the collapse of old medicine, another supreme power was shaken to its core, the absolute power of the Church. In the Middle Ages, religion held total life and death authority over both the physical and spiritual lives of the people. People believed the Church was the voice of God, an impenetrable shield protecting them from all disasters. But when the Black Death swept through, the tragedy spared no one. Priests, bishops, and the most devout monks also caught the disease, their bodies rotted, and they dropped dead right on the pulpit just like thieves in the market. Thousands of all-night prayer vigils, tens of thousands of amulets, bloody processions of self-flagellating zealots, all fell silent in the face of the bacterium's cold indifference. Initially, this utter despair and extreme panic caused bouts of violent madness. People frantically searched for scapegoats, leading to horrific massacres targeting the Jewish community or heretics. But deep within the minds of the surviving Europeans, a seed of doubt had been permanently sown. For the first time, they dared to quietly ask themselves, why did God's representatives die such miserable deaths? Could it be that this system isn't as divine as they preach? By what laws does this world truly operate? This decline in blind faith was the first crack in the wall of power. That crack grew wider, becoming the direct precursor to the Protestant Reformation that shook Europe, and later the Age of Enlightenment, where reason and science reigned supreme, replacing fear and submission. And here is perhaps the most ironic and surprising truth about how the modern world was born: the development of grand technology did not stem from the kindness or the desire of the elite to liberate humanity. The elite didn't invent machines because they were smart or because they wanted a better world. They created machines for a highly pragmatic and selfish reason: they couldn't find anyone willing to do heavy lifting for them at a dirt-cheap price anymore. Human labor had become too expensive. When half the workforce dissolved into the earth, the severe labor shortage forced society to find new ways to survive and maintain production. Peasants were now more valuable, so they couldn't waste time. They quickly adopted and improved heavy iron plows to till deeper, applying a three-field crop rotation system to maximize agricultural output with minimal human effort. Merchants designed larger ships, operated by complex sail systems to require fewer sailors while still carrying more cargo. The thirst to improve efficiency also strongly propelled the development of firearms and metallurgy. Even the severe shortage of copyist monks to reproduce Bibles and books created massive pressure. That pressure drove Johannes Gutenberg to invent the movable type printing press in 1453, one of the most important inventions in history, allowing knowledge to spread at the speed of light instead of being imprisoned in monasteries. The very pressure of having to do more, to produce more with a smaller number of people, laid the first and most solid foundational bricks for the Industrial Revolution that would permanently alter the face of the earth later on. But now, close your eyes. Imagine there is a time rewind button, and we go back to 1347. The sky at the port of Sicily is clear, the wind blows gently. 12 merchant ships dock. Cargo is unloaded. The rats on the ships are completely clean, they scurry into the alleys carrying no pathogens whatsoever. The Black Death is erased from the timeline. 75 to 200 million people don't have to die. A scenario that sounds like a perfect dream, a happy ending for humanity. But what is the horrifying truth? If that scenario happened, the world would freefall into a deep abyss of eternal stagnation. Without the Black Death to clear the way, humanity would crash into an equally terrifying nightmare, the Malthusian trap. Economist Thomas Malthus pointed out a brutally harsh law of survival: population always grows exponentially, while the capacity to produce food only grows arithmetically. If there are no technological breakthroughs, the day will come when the number of mouths to feed exceeds the limits of what the land can nourish. Before 1347, Europe was right on the brink of that limit. The population was too dense, every plot of land, no matter how barren, had been cultivated, yet food was still insufficient. Imagine in Europe without disease, but suffocatingly packed with people. Every road, every forest is crammed with destitute peasants. And then, an ecological tragedy strikes. During that period, the Earth began entering the Little Ice Age. The climate became erratically freezing, prolonged heavy rains rotted the wheat fields across northern Europe. In our historical timeline, the population was small, so the food reserves were barely enough to sustain them. But in this hypothetical timeline, with tens of millions of surplus mouths, famine would not just be a rare phenomenon every few decades. It would become an annual tragedy, a culture of starvation. Famine doesn't kill quickly and decisively like a bacterial invasion. It is a prolonged torture that hollows out the human body and dignity. Millions wouldn't die from black buboes swelling on their necks, they would die as skin and bone skeletons, dragging themselves across the muddy ground. People would eat every weed, strip every tree of its bark, chew clay to fill their empty stomachs, and when everything ran out, stories of people tearing each other apart and resorting to cannibalism would become obvious, everyday realities. The world wouldn't die of illness, but of resource limits, a slow, agonizing death dragging on from one century to the next. In that suffocating and starving world, the feudal system would never collapse, it would continue to stand strong for hundreds more years. When the population is too large and everyone is willing to kill each other for a moldy piece of bread, human labor holds absolutely zero value. There would always be millions of peasants ready to be lifelong slaves just to escape starving to death out there. The feudal lords would continue to sit leisurely in their castles, maintaining absolute supremacy without ever facing any resistance or upward pressure. The concept of a wage increase would not exist. There would be no freedom of movement or choice of occupation. The concept of a middle class, merchants, people with an independent voice, would be strangled in the cradle. Society would be permanently frozen in the shape of an extreme pyramid, a tiny group of nobles living in luxury on the sweat and blood of hundreds of millions of impoverished slaves. And when people are so cheap, the suffocation of technological and intellectual progress is inevitable. Why would a landlord bother investing money to invent an iron plow, a steam engine, or a complex irrigation system when out there are 10,000 people willing to work barehanded, digging the dirt with their fingernails at zero cost? The laziness of the elite would kill all innovation. Crises are always the ruthless engines that force humanity to move forward. Without a severe labor shortage, the Industrial Revolution might have been delayed indefinitely. You and I, in an alternate timeline, might still be using chipped wooden plows and living without electricity well into the 20th century, or even the present day. Furthermore, without a terrifying shock to shake the entire belief structure of society, the power of the aristocracy and the church would never be chipped away. They would continue to maintain the ignorance of the masses to make them easier to rule. Revolutionary ideas about human equality, democratic rights, freedom of speech, or experimental science might never have the chance to sprout. The brilliant Renaissance with geniuses like Da Vinci and Michelangelo would not exist. The Age of Enlightenment, with the theories shaping the free world by philosophers like John Locke or Voltaire, would forever remain in the dark. Human history is an incredibly fragile chain of dominoes. Change just one massive variable, and the entire trajectory of social evolution veers off into a dark and hopeless branch. We like to delude ourselves that humanity moves forward through love, intellect, and empathy. But history laughs in our faces with a cold-blooded, thorny, and hard-to-swallow truth. Sometimes, the price of the greatest progress is paid with the most brutal tragedy. The Black Death was an inexcusable nightmare, it brought immeasurable pain to the souls who once breathed on this earth. But looking through the ruthless lens of centuries later, it was the necessary hellfire that burned down a rotting, ancient forest, freeing up space and light for the new green shoots of civilization to rise. It decisively smashed an unjust feudal system, forcing people to overcome their laziness to think scientifically, invent machines, and use their own two hands to liberate themselves from the chains of theocracy and class. The modern world, with its skyscrapers, space flights, advanced medicine, and our fundamental freedoms, all of it, without exception, was born from the very ashes of the Black Death. So, after reaching the absolute end of this historical truth, I want to leave you with one final question, a question that might make you toss and turn in your sleep. Imagine right now, there is a time button placed in front of you. If you press it, you will go back in time and completely wipe out the plague-carrying rats at the port of Sicily in 1347. 50 million innocent people will survive and return to their families. But the price you pay is that this entire modern world will be erased instantly, and you yourself will be thrown back into a muddy farm at the very bottom of a feudal society, living as a serf under tyrannical rule until the end of your days. The lives of 50 million people in exchange for the permanent freedom and progress of all humanity. Between morality and the selfishness of civilization, would you dare to press the button? Let me know your most honest decision in the comments section. Your choice will reveal who you truly are. Don't forget to hit like, share this video with friends who love a good debate, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crazy historical plot twist. See you in other timelines.